passed out. I don't know. We're trying to find some life. A few males and females have been shot. Upon that, there's like 500 people.
Welcome to another Deep Dive, listeners. This time, we're going deep into a case that really shook the LAPD.
Yeah. The murder of Sherry Rasmussen.
It's got it all: betrayal, a father's fight for justice, and the power of DNA evidence.
23 years this one took to solve. Every twist and turn, it pulls you in deeper.
Let's start with Sherry Rasmussen herself. Who was she before all of this?
Sherry, she was an amazing woman, an accomplished nurse.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. In her late 20s, director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center even, teaching other nurses, giving presentations, a real up-and-comer, recently married to John Ruetten. You know, starting their lives together.
Sounds like the perfect life.
Yeah.
And then this brutal crime. Can you walk us through the crime scene?
Oh, it was awful. Sherry was found on the living room floor, shot 3 times, signs of a struggle everywhere. A broken vase, a bloody handprint near the burglar alarm, furniture overturned.
Like a chaotic scene.
Total chaos.
And at first, the investigation seemed pretty open and shut, like a burglary gone wrong.
On the surface, yeah. Missing items, forced entry. Seemed like it. But there were some things that maybe should have raised some questions. The way the stereo equipment was stacked, for example. Almost too neat, you know.
And then comes the twist. Enter Stephanie Lazarus,
John Ruetten's ex-girlfriend.
who just happened to be an LAPD officer.
Talk about adding another layer. And Sherry's father, Nels Rasmussen, he suspected Lazarus right from the beginning. Kept pushing the police to look into her, but they didn't listen.
So they were focused on this burglary angle,
Mm-hmm.
and the case went cold. For years. What was the turning point? What brought it back to life?
Fast forward to 2009, LAPD is making a big push to solve cold cases.
Okay.
Detectives Jim Nuttall and Pete Barba, they take a fresh look at their Rasmussen case. And they start to have doubts about the burglary theory.
Seeing the inconsistencies?
Exactly. The crime scene, the evidence, it wasn't adding up.
And this is where that blood-stained stereo equipment comes in.
Bingo! Blood on the stereo, Sherry's blood. It was stacked after she was already dead, meaning the scene was staged.
Oh, wow. So someone wanted it to look like a burglary.
Exactly. And that threw the whole burglary idea out the window, shifted the focus to a more targeted attack.
And who became the prime suspect?
You guessed it, Stephanie Lazarus. And then DNA technology enters the picture and the case explodes.
I love when science comes into play. So
Yeah.
how did they use DNA to connect Lazarus to the crime after all this time?
Okay, so remember that bite mark on Sherry's arm? Well,
Mhm.
back in 1986, DNA analysis wasn't what it is now, but over time it got a lot better, right?
Right.
So detectives were able to get a DNA sample from Lazarus, compared it to the DNA from that bite mark, and it was a match, linking her to the crime scene 23 years later.
It's like something out of a movie.
Yeah.
So they finally have their suspect, and she's an LAPD officer. I bet the rest was pretty intense.
It was a whole covert operation. Detectives got Lazarus to come down to Parker Center, LAPD headquarters, told her it was for an art theft investigation.
Her specialty.
Yeah. Interviewed her, got what they needed, and then bam, confronted her with the DNA evidence. Tried to leave. They arrested her right there in the hallway.
What a scene. I can only imagine the shockwaves that sent through the LAPD, having one of their own implicated in something so horrific.
Oh, it was a huge scandal. Put on leave immediately, later allowed to retire early. Really tarnished their image.
So what happened next? The trial, the arguments from each side, lay it all out for us.
Trial started in 2012. The prosecution. They honed right in on Lazarus's mode of jealousy. They said she was obsessed with Ruetten, couldn't handle him being with someone else.
Ah, the classic love triangle gone wrong.
Yeah.
But how did they specifically connect her to the actual murder?
They presented evidence about how Lazarus acted towards Sherry, a confrontation at Sherry's workplace, for one, painting her as a scorned lover driven to kill. And, of course, they have that DNA evidence from the bite mark.
What about the defense? What was their strategy?
They tried to poke holes in the prosecution's case, highlighted missing evidence from the initial investigation, especially the murder weapon. Lazarus said her .38 caliber handgun was stolen not long after the murder, never found.
Right.
So they argued the case was mostly circumstantial, relying too much on the DNA.
So they were trying to plant that seed of doubt. Maybe someone else did it.
Exactly. Tried to bring the burglary theory back, suggesting maybe Sherry surprised a robber and was killed. They said the police were so fixated on Lazarus that they missed other leads.
But didn't that blood on the stereo equipment debunk that theory?
You're right, and the prosecution hit that hard? Reminded the jury about the placement of the stereo with Sherry's blood on it. That pretty much confirmed the scene was staged.
Sounds like a tense back and forth. Any moments from the trial that really stand out?
John Rueten's testimony. He took the stand, and through tears, he talked about his relationships with both Sherry and Lazarus.
Oh, wow.
It was a powerful moment, gave you a glimpse into this twisted love triangle at the heart of it all.
So after weeks of testimony, all that scrutiny, the jury delivered their verdict.
After days of deliberating, they came back with guilty. First-degree murder, sent shockwaves through the LAPD, the whole city, a decorated LAPD detective convicted of murder. Huge blow to the LAPD's reputation.
What was the sentence?
27 years to life. A heavy sentence that shows how serious the crime was, how calculative her actions were. Sent a message, no one's above the law, not even the police.
It's almost like poetic justice. A detective who put people behind bars, now facing the same fate.
Exactly. Reminds us we're all subject to the same laws no matter who we are.
So Lazarus is behind bars, but that's not the end of the story. There were still a lot of unanswered questions about how the LAPD handled the case, weren't there? We'll get into that right after this. We're back, and we're picking up right where we left off. Stephanie Lazarus's conviction. But even with that, there were still a lot of questions hanging over the LAPD's handling of the whole thing, right?
Oh, absolutely. Those lawsuits filed by Sherry's parents and Jennifer Francis, the criminalist, brought some pretty unsettling stuff to light. It looked like the LAPD might have tried to protect Lazarus during the initial investigation.
Let's back up for a sec. Remind our listeners about those lawsuits. What were the specific accusations they were making?
Well, Sherry's parents, they were saying the LAPD deliberately ignored evidence that pointed towards Lazarus, maybe to protect one of their own.
Makes you wonder.
They said the investigators just blew off their concerns about Lazarus and clung to that burglary theory, even when the evidence was saying otherwise.
And Jennifer Francis's lawsuit, what was that all about?
Francis, she was the one who analyzed the DNA from the bite mark. She claimed the LAPD pressured her to downplay the fact that they'd found female DNA at the crime scene.
Wow.
And she said when she raised concerns about the investigation and how it might be connected to Lazarus, she faced retaliation.
That's heavy stuff. It's pretty disturbing to think that the people we're supposed to trust to uphold the law might have been trying to obstruct justice. So what happened with those lawsuits in the end?
Both of them were eventually dismissed. But not because the court found the claims to be false, more like it was a technicality thing. The statute of limitations had run out on some of the claims, meaning too much time had passed since the alleged misconduct for the court to consider them.
So for those of us who aren't lawyers, can you break down what statute of limitations actually means?
Sure, think of it like a deadline for filing certain types of legal claims. It's meant to make sure people bring their cases forward while the evidence is still fresh and witnesses remember things clearly.
Okay.
In the Rasmussen case, some of the alleged misconduct happened way back, decades before the lawsuits were filed, so those claims were basically thrown out because of this statute of limitations.
Got it. So even though the lawsuits themselves were dismissed, the fact that they were even filed must have had some impact on the LAPD and how the public saw them.
Oh, definitely. Those lawsuits kept the pressure on the LAPD, made people question whether they could really be trusted to investigate their own people and hold their officers accountable.
So Lazarus is convicted, the lawsuits are gone, but the story doesn't end there. We got another twist, and it's a big one, her confession. After years of denying any involvement, she finally admitted to killing Sherry Rasmussen during a parole hearing in 2023. What do you make of that? Was it real remorse, or was it some kind of play to manipulate the parole board?
Tough to say for sure. Some people think she finally hit a point where she couldn't live with the lie anymore and it was a genuine outpouring of remorse. Others think it was a calculated move, a way to get sympathy and a shot at freedom.
I can see why some people would be skeptical. It does seem a little too convenient that she suddenly confesses after all those years of denying it. What was the reaction from Sherry's family and friends?
They were devastated, understandably. Can you imagine having to relive that trauma all over again after all those years? They've been through the trial, the sentencing, and now this confession brought all those old wounds back to the surface.
It's heartbreaking. And what about the parole board? How did they react to Lazarus's confession?
Their reaction was interesting. At first, they granted her parole.
Really?
Yeah. But then there was a huge outcry against it. Sherry's family and friends campaigned like crazy to keep her locked up. Even some law enforcement folks spoke out, saying that what Lazarus did was too awful, her lies too deep, to let her out early. So in the end, the parole board reversed their decision. Her parole was revoked.
So Lazarus stays behind bars. But the shadow of this case is still long. Even with those lawsuits being dismissed, there's still questions about how the LAPD handled that initial investigation. Do you think there's any chance that important evidence was missed or even hidden, allowing Lazarus to avoid justice for so many years?
It's hard to say for sure, but yeah, it's possible. We still don't have all the answers about why Nels Rasmussen's worries about Lazarus were dismissed so quickly. And the way the LAPD jumped on that burglary theory, even with all those red flags we talked about, makes you wonder if they were really focused on finding the truth or if they were more concerned with protecting one of their own.
It's a sobering thought. This case really highlights how messed up things can get when institutional failures collide with the human cost of justice delayed.
It makes you think about how hard it is to hold people in power accountable. We expect the police to protect us, so what happens when they're the ones who need to be investigated? Who polices the police?
We're back, and man, this case, it's been a roller coaster ride, hasn't it?
It really has.
We've seen betrayal, the incredible things forensic science can do, and how tough it can be to hold powerful people accountable.
It really makes you stop and think, how hard is it to actually get justice when the system itself might be working against you?
That's the thing that sticks with me. Not just the evidence in the trial and the confession, but the image of Nels Rasmussen, Sherry's dad, fighting for his daughter, never giving up, even when it seemed like everyone else had written her off.
It's a lesson, right? We can't just sit back and expect institutions to always do the right thing. Sometimes it takes regular people like Nels Rasmussen to stand up and demand answers, to refuse to be silenced.
His persistence is incredible. But this whole thing also brings up some bigger questions, doesn't it? About police accountability, cover-ups, how we make sure justice is actually served when the people we're supposed to trust might be the ones in the way.
Yeah, this case really gets you thinking about that. How do you hold powerful people accountable? What happens when the police, the people who are supposed to protect us, are the ones who need investigating?
It's a scary thought. So what can we do to prevent these situations from happening? How do we make sure investigations are done right, no matter who the suspect is?
Independent oversight, that's key. We need ways to investigate potential misconduct within police departments, but those investigations have to be done by people who are totally independent, not influenced or pressured by the police themselves.
So something like a civilian review board, where people from outside the police department have the power to look into complaints against officers.
Exactly. That kind of outside oversight helps make sure investigations are thorough, unbiased, and that officers are held responsible if they do something wrong. It shows the community that the police department cares about being transparent and accountable.
What about whistleblowers? People like Jennifer. It takes guts to speak truth to power, especially when your own job and reputation are at stake.
Absolutely. But those voices, they're crucial. They can expose corruption, stop abuses of power, and help us create a system that's actually fair.
Looking back on this whole case, it's hard not to feel angry, knowing Sherry Rasmussen might still be alive if the LAPD had just listened to Nels Rasmussen and investigated Stephanie Lazarus properly in the first place.
It's a tragedy. Shows what can happen when institutions fail and how much delaying justice can cost.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive, but what are the key takeaways you'd want our listeners to walk away with?
We can't just blindly trust institutions, even the ones meant to protect us. We have to think critically, question the stories we're told, especially from people in power, and be willing to speak up for what's right, even when it's hard.
And to never, ever stop fighting for justice, no matter how long it takes or how powerful the people against you might be.
Truth has a way of coming out, even if it takes years.
This case, it's got everything. Twists and turns, heartbreak, and ultimately, a hard-won victory. It shows us the dark side of human nature, but also resilience, courage, and the power of truth.
It reminds us we all have a part to play in holding those in power accountable and working towards a world where justice is a reality, not just an ideal.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll have some links in the show notes if you want to learn more about this case. And always remember, truth matters, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it takes a long time to reveal itself. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.